impossible for any of us in 15 minutes, it's impossible for all of us combined to take up all the ways that we could look at Marxism and feminism. So I want to start by talking about my involvement. It's almost 40 years since I got involved in politics. And when I was a young 17-year-old, I joined an organisation called the International Marxist Group, which was then the British section of the Fourth International. And I've been involved in that political current ever since. And one of the reasons I joined that political current and that I've remained inside that current since then was the support of that current for the principle of support for an autonomous women's movement. And I want to look at why that was important to me and what I think, and why I think it's important in principle and what I think it means. In Cinzia's book, which I hope anybody who hasn't so far had the pleasure to read will do so very quickly after tonight, she does many things, but one of the things she does is look at the early history of the socialist and communist movement and the debates that those movements had around class and gender and the interrelationship between them, looking at to what extent all women were oppressed, the specific oppression of working class women and so on. And I think those are very rich discussions, and we can learn a lot from many of the women and some of the men who participated in those discussions. But the organisational conclusions that most of those early organisations of the left drew in terms of their attitude to what was traditionally called the women's question, always I thought a strange formulation, as if there was some other question, was to set up their own women's organisations that were generally tied to those political parties, and certainly which were often seen and often acted primarily as transmission belts for women who were active in the mass movement into those organisations. The approach the Fourth International adopted in the 1970s was not that approach, and I think this wasn't an accident. I think it happened because large numbers of young feminist activists were coming into politics at that time, and most of us, and many of us certainly, our first political experience was around questions of women's oppression. And we saw ourselves as participants in the women's movement as being as much of our political self-description as any other aspect of our politics. And that meant that our attitude was not that we sent people along to meetings of the women's movement. We went to women's movement meetings because that was something that we were personally committed to, that we were activists in that movement in the same way as we might have seen ourselves as student activists, as trade union activists, as anti-racist activists, and so on. It was part of who we were. And I'm not saying at all that the discussions within the Fourth International at that time were uncontroversial. One of the things that we have on the book's stall tonight is documents of the Fourth International in that period. The FI as an international grouping adopted a long resolution on women's liberation in 1979. There are certainly things in that resolution that I and a number of women active in Europe didn't particularly support. There were debates within the FI between comrades, primarily comrades in North America, on the one hand, and comrades in Europe. And I think probably most of us would write things in the book rather differently today. But it was, I think, the nature of the feminist movement that emerged, what we now call second wave feminism, that emerged in that political period, that posed new challenges that some sections of the radical left were able to meet. The women's liberation movement that erupted in North America and in Europe at that period of time, and later developed in other parts of the world, was, I would say, as a whole, an anti-systemic movement. It didn't think that we could achieve the end to the oppression of women that we were fighting against by just tinkering around at the edges. That didn't mean that there weren't fierce debates within that movement. There were many strategic differences, and some of the but they were debates that I think, as feminist activists within the revolutionary left, we were able to take on, yes, with support from our organisations as a whole, but they were debates, whether on the question of alliances, which I'll come back to, on the questions of racism, where certainly in this country where I was politically active, we saw increasingly groups of black women saying that they weren't going to choose between fighting racism and fighting sexism, and that they were calling out a women's movement that took its inspiration to some extent from the development of the Black Power movement, but didn't do enough systematically to look at racism in its own structures and in its own political priorities. It didn't understand that, for example, for many black women, the role of the family could be rather different than it is for the majority of white women, because in some situations the family can be a defence against racism, and so black women refused to make those choices. Lesbians also went through different but similar debates in situations where there was too much tendency to run away from what some feminists saw as an assumption that women were separatists by coming out with lesbophobic statements, and all of those debates were going on. And I'm not at all arguing that in that period of enormous political turmoil, that me as an individual or the organisations of the Fourth International that I was part of got everything right. I'm sure that we made mistakes and we had many bitter debates both inside the organisation and outside it. But I think that the slogan that guided us, and that I think has guided me on these questions across 40 years, and remains as true today as it did in the beginning, is no socialist revolution without women's liberation, no women's liberation without socialist revolution. I think that on the radical left, there's a general understanding of the importance of the bit that says no women's liberation without socialist revolution. We can explain why it's impossible to change the fundamental position of women in this society without a fundamental transformation and an ending of the profit motive. But we don't always get right the need to fundamentally transform the way that we're socialised in this society, and therefore to have ongoing ways of organising within our political organisations. Another work that I commend to people, which is available on internationalviewpoint.org and was given as a paper at this year's Historical Materialism here in London, is a paper by my friend and comrade Penelope Duggan on the feminist challenges to traditional political organising, in which Penny explains that unless women are organised on an ongoing basis within revolutionary, and I would say more generally within political organising, then there will be a tendency for those organisations to reproduce the division of labour that exists within society as a whole, that it'll always be the women that take the minutes, that do the administrative jobs, that women won't be given the space not only to be experts on our own oppression, but actually to understand that that oppression also involves us being part of the working class as a whole. Women are 52% of the working class. We've as much right to be experts on questions of economy, questions of trade union organising and so on. And that means that the way our organisations tend to reproduce the division of labour that exists in our society needs to be challenged on an ongoing basis. I haven't said about a quarter of what I wanted to say, but I think Susan's about to tell me to shut up, so I think I'm going to leave it at that level.
That was a nice introduction.